I was gone for 8 days. Not 8 weeks, not 8 months. 8 days. Long enough to help my older brother Caleb move a stubborn herd of cattle across a stretch of land near the Wyoming border, but not long enough for anyone to completely change my life. At least that's what I thought. The day I came home started like any other drive back to the ranch. I remember having one hand on the steering wheel, a cup of cold gas station coffee in the other, and that familiar feeling you get when you're finally heading toward a place that belongs to you. My ranch wasn't much to look at if you compared it to the fancy properties popping up all over the county. It wasn't designed for magazine covers. It was practical. 48 acres of pasture, a weathered barn that had survived more storms than I could count, a modest farmhouse my father built himself, and a western fence line that had stood in roughly the same place since my grandfather's day. I knew every inch of that property. I knew where the grass grew thick after spring rain. I knew which gate always sagged a little in July heat. I knew exactly where every cedar fence post stood. Which is why something felt wrong before I even understood what I was looking at. The moment my truck turned onto the gravel driveway, my stomach tightened. You ever walk into your own house and instantly know somebody moved something? Not because you can immediately identify it, just because the whole place feels different. That was the feeling. Everything looked cleaner, straighter, almost artificial. Then I saw it. I hit the brakes so hard my coffee flew into the dashboard. The fence was gone, not damaged, not partially removed, gone. Every cedar post, every strand of old barbed wire, every section my grandfather and father had repaired over the years. In its place stood a tall cream-colored vinyl privacy fence that stretched along the frontage like it had been there forever. For a second I honestly wondered whether exhaustion was making me hallucinate. Then I noticed something even stranger. Near the road stood a giant stone monument surrounded by decorative landscaping, fresh flowers, decorative rock, ground lighting, and carved into the center were the words, "Welcome to Willow Creek Preserve." I stared at it for several seconds. Willow Creek Preserve was the new upscale subdivision built next to my ranch. A few years earlier, the land east of mine had been cattle pasture too. Then a developer bought it, brought in investors, and transformed it into one of those communities where every mailbox matched and every lawn looked like it was measured with a ruler. We had never really interacted. They stayed over there. I stayed over here. At least that's what I thought. I parked near the barn and walked toward the new fence. The closer I got, the worse things looked. It wasn't just that they replaced my fence. The entire fence line sat farther into my pasture. I didn't need a surveyor to tell me that. You spend your entire life walking the same property and your eyes become a measuring tool. Something was off, way off. About halfway back to the house, I found an envelope taped to the barn door. No certified mail, no legal notice, no attempt at a conversation, just a plain white envelope fluttering in the breeze. Inside was a single sheet of paper. I still remember reading it twice because I genuinely couldn't believe it. Boundary modification completed in accordance with community expansion plans. Thank you for your cooperation. That was it. No signature, no explanation, no contact information. Just a thank you note for a decision I never agreed to. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because sometimes when something is that ridiculous, your brain doesn't know how else to respond. I stood there looking across my pasture and thinking, somebody really believed this would work. That evening I unlocked the old filing cabinet in my office. My father had been obsessed with records, every deed, every survey, every easement, every tax document, all organized and labeled. Growing up, I thought it was excessive. That night I silently thanked him. For nearly 3 hours I sat at my desk comparing documents, maps, and old survey reports. Around midnight I found the original county survey from decades earlier. The next morning I grabbed a metal detector and headed for the property line. The first marker took almost 20 minutes to locate. Fresh dirt had been pushed over it. The second marker wasn't much easier. The third was buried deeper than I expected. But every single one was exactly where the document said it should be. The legal boundary hadn't moved. Not 1 inch. I remember standing there staring at that third marker while the morning sun came up over the pasture. That's when the situation stopped feeling confusing and started feeling intentional. Nobody had corrected a mistake. Nobody had discovered an old surveying error. Nobody had accidentally crossed a line. Someone had simply ignored the line altogether. The more measurements I took, the angrier I became. Not explosive anger. The quiet kind. The kind that sits in your chest and gets heavier every hour. The fence appeared to be nearly 10 feet inside my property. 10 feet doesn't sound like much until you stretch it across hundreds of feet of road frontage. Then it becomes valuable land, very valuable land, and that's when I noticed something else. The stone monument wasn't just sitting on the surface. It had a concrete foundation, a deep one. Fresh irrigation lines ran underneath the landscaping. Electrical conduit fed power to decorative lighting. This wasn't a quick weekend project. This entrance had been planned, approved, engineered, funded, constructed. A lot of people had participated in making this happen, which meant a lot of people either knew exactly where the boundary was or never bothered to check. That night I sat on my porch watching headlights flow into Willow Creek Preserve. Families came home from work. Teenagers drove through the entrance. Delivery trucks rolled in and out. Everyone looked completely normal, completely unaware. Nobody inside that neighborhood seemed to realize that a portion of what they were driving across belonged to somebody else. I kept staring at the entrance, the sign, the landscaping, the traffic. Then a thought occurred to me, a simple thought, one that changed everything. If the fence moved 10 feet, what else moved with it? I got up from the porch, walked back inside, spread the surveys across my kitchen table, and started measuring again. The answer hit me about 20 minutes later. When I finally saw it, I leaned back in my chair and laughed harder than I had all week, because the fence wasn't actually their biggest problem. Not even close. The real problem was sitting directly behind it, and once I confirmed what I was looking at, I realized somebody in Willow Creek Preserve was about to have a very, very bad month. The next morning, I called a surveying company that had been working in our county longer than I'd been alive. I didn't tell them my theory. I didn't tell them I thought a developer had crossed onto my property. I didn't tell them about the fence, the sign, or the ridiculous letter taped to my barn. I simply said, I need a complete boundary verification. The woman on the phone paused for a second and said, "You sound like a man who already knows the answer." I laughed. Maybe I do. 3 days later, a crew arrived with enough equipment to launch a space mission. GPS units, tripods, metal detectors, survey rods, stacks of paperwork. The lead surveyor was a gray-haired guy named Walt. He'd probably forgotten more about property lines than most people would ever learn. For most of the afternoon, I followed them around the property. Not because I didn't trust them, because I wanted to hear what they weren't saying. Surveyors have a way of communicating without actually communicating. A raised eyebrow, a quiet whistle, a glance exchanged between coworkers. Those little signals tell you everything. Around sunset, Walt walked toward me carrying a clipboard. His expression already told the story. "You better come take a look," he said. I followed him to the frontage road. Bright orange flags now stretched across the landscape. The legal boundary ran perfectly straight, clean, precise, undeniable. The problem for Willow Creek Preserve was that the line didn't stop at their fancy fence. It continued directly through their entrance. Not beside it, not near it, through it, right down the middle. For several seconds I simply stood there. Then I started laughing. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. The entrance road itself crossed onto my property. Half of the primary access point for the entire development sat on land they didn't own. Every resident, every moving truck, every delivery driver, every contractor, every realtor, every potential buyer, all of them were driving across private property. I looked at Walt. He looked back at me. Then he said the most severe thing I've ever heard. Well, that's unfortunate, unfortunate. That was one way to describe it. Potentially catastrophic was another. That evening I spread the new survey across my dining room table. The orange line cut directly through the road. The more I studied it, the clearer the situation became. The monument sign wasn't the problem. The landscaping wasn't the problem. The fence wasn't even the problem anymore. The road was the problem. Without that road, the development had no practical entrance. And without an entrance, they had a crisis. Now here's the thing. A lot of people hear stories like this and immediately imagine some dramatic confrontation. Screaming, threats, police cars. That isn't how most real battles are won. The people who lose control first usually lose everything else afterward, so I decided not to visit the HOA office. I didn't call the developer. I didn't post anything online. Instead, I made a few phone calls. The first went to my attorney. The second went to a local equipment rental company. The third went to a towing service. By Friday afternoon, everything was ready, and the timing couldn't have been more perfect if I had planned it months in advance. That weekend happened to be Willow Creek Preserve's annual showcase event, their biggest sales weekend of the year. Advertisements were everywhere. Radio stations were talking about it. Billboards promoted it. People were traveling from neighboring counties to tour model homes. The development expected hundreds of visitors. I knew because I had seen the advertisements myself. Saturday morning, I woke up before sunrise, made a pot of coffee, sat quietly on the porch, and waited. There's something strangely calming about knowing exactly what you're about to do. No uncertainty, no doubt, just patience. Around 7:30, I climbed into my tractor. An old green machine that had spent most of its life hauling hay. Not exactly glamorous, but dependable. I drove it toward the disputed section of roadway, following the survey markers, following the legal boundary, following the facts. When I reached the location, I parked it across the portion of road sitting on my property. Then I placed portable barriers beside it, not blocking the entire entrance, just enough to prevent unrestricted traffic across my land. Everything positioned exactly where the survey showed my ownership began. Nothing illegal, nothing destructive, nothing emotional, just very inconvenient. Then I unfolded a lawn chair, poured a fresh cup of coffee, and sat down. The first visitors arrived around 8:30. A couple driving a luxury SUV slowed to a stop. The husband rolled down his window. "Road construction?" he asked. "Nope." "What happened?" "Property dispute." His eyebrows shot up immediately. His wife grabbed her phone. That was the beginning. By 9:30, the traffic backup had doubled. By 10 o'clock, it stretched nearly half a mile. People started getting curious, then fascinated. A group of prospective buyers stood near the monument sign discussing the situation. Several were recording videos. One guy started live streaming. Another woman was asking residents questions. The entire thing spread faster than I expected. And trust me, it spread fast. There's nothing social media loves more than rich neighborhoods having public problems. By 11 o'clock, realtors were sweating. Sales representatives were pacing. Visitors were turning around and leaving. Homeowners were gathering near the entrance trying to figure out what was happening. I remained exactly where I started, sitting in my lawn chair, drinking coffee, watching. Around noon, a black luxury SUV pulled up. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man who looked like he had never lost an argument in his entire life. Tall, perfect haircut, designer sunglasses, pressed polo shirt, expensive watch. His name, I would soon learn, was Grant Mercer, president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. Grant walked toward me with the confidence of someone accustomed to giving orders. "Are you the owner of this property?" he asked. I nodded. "Then you need to move this equipment immediately." I took another sip of coffee. "Why?" His jaw tightened slightly. "Because you're obstructing a private roadway." I reached into my folder and handed him a copy of the survey. "No," I said, "you're using private property." His confidence disappeared faster than I expected. He looked down at the documents, studied the highlighted sections, examined the maps, then looked back toward the entrance. The smile he'd arrived with was gone. There must be some misunderstanding. No misunderstanding. Our contractors followed approved plans. Then your contractors followed the wrong plans. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. Traffic continued backing up behind him. People continued recording. The longer he stood there, the more attention he attracted. Finally, he lowered his voice. "Let's be reasonable." I almost laughed. People always say that when they're asking someone else to absorb the consequences of their own mistake. "I am being reasonable," I replied. "I've been reasonable since the moment I got home and found my fence missing." His eyes narrowed. "You don't understand the amount of money involved here." "Actually," I said, "I think that's exactly why we're standing here." That hit harder than I intended, because deep down he knew it was true. This wasn't some accidental garden fence. This was a major development project. Money had been spent, contracts signed, deadlines established, investors promised results. And somewhere along the way somebody decided checking the property line wasn't important, or maybe they assumed I wouldn't fight back. Either possibility was bad. Grant glanced over his shoulder. The crowd had grown larger. Several residents were openly watching. One man was recording every second of the conversation. A group of potential buyers stood near the monument sign whispering among themselves. The entire situation was becoming impossible to hide. And public embarrassment is one thing HOAs fear almost as much as lawsuits. Grant handed back the survey. "We'll be speaking with our attorneys," I nodded. "That's probably a good idea." Then he turned around and walked away. Not storming, not yelling, just walking. The way people walk when they suddenly realize a problem is much bigger than they thought. As he disappeared into the crowd, I leaned back in my chair and watched the entrance descend further into chaos. Because what Grant didn't know yet was that the survey had already uncovered one serious problem. And later that same afternoon, I was about to discover another one. One that would put the county itself into the middle of the fight. After Grant left, I stayed in that lawn chair for another couple of hours. Not because I needed to, because I wanted to think. The crowd eventually thinned out. Some visitors left. Others found alternate ways into the development. Realtors kept trying to save the event, smiling through the kind of stress that makes your eye twitch when nobody's looking. By late afternoon, I folded up the chair, loaded the barriers back onto the trailer, and headed home. The tractor had done exactly what I needed it to do. It got everyone's attention. Now it was time for paperwork. That evening, I called the county planning office. The woman who answered sounded friendly enough, probably expecting a routine zoning question. Instead, I asked something very specific. Has Willow Creek Preserve ever received approval to relocate their primary entrance road? There was a pause, keyboard clicking, more silence. Then she said, "According to our records, no." I sat up straighter. "Are you sure?" One moment, more typing. A longer pause. Finally, she came back. "The approved entrance location remains exactly where it was shown on the original development plans." I thanked her and hung up. Then I stared at the wall for a solid minute, because that answer changed everything. Up until that moment, this had been a property dispute, a serious one, but still a dispute between landowners. Now there was potentially a permitting issue, and counties tend to get very interested when roads, infrastructure, and development plans stop matching approved records. The next few days felt like watching dominoes fall, one after another. Word spread throughout the county. People talked. Contractors talked. Realtors talked. Residents talked. Small towns are funny that way. News doesn't travel, it teleports. By Wednesday, I was hearing stories from people I had never met. A contractor told me buyers were asking uncomfortable questions during tour. A local banker told me investors were suddenly requesting additional documentation. Someone at the feed store mentioned hearing that 2 home sales had been postponed. Nobody knew exactly what was happening. But everyone knew something was happening. And uncertainty is expensive, especially in real estate. Late Thursday afternoon, a black sedan pulled into my driveway. This time Grant wasn't alone. He brought an attorney. The lawyer introduced himself as Michael Reeves, middle-aged, calm, professional. The kind of man who understood that facts don't care about confidence. That immediately made him more dangerous than Grant. We stood near the disputed entrance while vehicles crawled through traffic behind us. Michael opened the conversation. "Mr. Turner, our clients would like to resolve this matter quickly." I appreciated that. No threats, no posturing, just reality. "That's probably wise," I said. He nodded. Then came the first offer. They would remove the fence, remove the monument, remove the landscaping, restore the original boundary. A week earlier I might have accepted. Honestly, I probably would have. But things had changed. Too much had happened. Too much money had already been poured into the project. And more importantly, too much unauthorized use had already occurred. I shook my head. "No." Grant looked genuinely shocked. "What do you mean, no?" I pointed toward the entrance. "You excavated the property." I pointed toward the monument. "You poured concrete, then toward the landscaping. You installed irrigation, then the lighting. You ran electrical systems, then the roadway. You redirected traffic patterns." I looked directly at him. "This stopped being a simple fence problem a long time ago." Michael remained silent, listening, thinking. Grant wasn't listening. Grant was reacting. Those are very different things. "So what exactly do you want?" he asked. That question had been coming for days. I reached into my folder and pulled out a packet of documents. Commercial frontage values, survey expenses, legal costs, property evaluations. Everything organized. Everything documented, everything supported. I handed the folder to Michael. "You have two options." He opened it immediately. Grant crossed his arms. "Option 1, I continued, you remove everything, close the entrance, restore the property, reapply for approvals, rebuild somewhere else." Neither man looked excited about that possibility. I wasn't surprised. The cost would have been enormous. Then I continued. "Option 2, you purchase a permanent easement." That got Michael's attention. Immediately, he started flipping through the numbers, reading carefully, calculating. Grant looked irritated. Michael looked concerned. Again, very different reactions. The easement terms were straightforward. Commercial market value for every square foot being used. Full reimbursement of survey expenses. Full reimbursement of legal costs. Compensation for unauthorized use. Permanent legal protections for both parties. Nothing outrageous. Nothing emotional, just business. After several minutes, Michael closed the folder. "We'll need time." "How much?" 48 hours, I nodded. "You have exactly 48. They left. And for the first time since this entire situation began, I felt calm, not confident, not victorious, just calm. Because regardless of what happened next, the facts weren't changing. The property line wasn't moving. The documents weren't disappearing. Reality remained reality. 46 hours later they returned. Not 45. Not 47, 46. That told me everything I needed to know. The paperwork was already prepared. Grant looked exhausted. Michael looked resigned. I suspected neither man had enjoyed those 2 days. The agreement sat between us on my dining room table, page after page, survey exhibits, legal descriptions, compensation schedules, permanent easement language, everything properly drafted, everything legally enforceable. I read every page, slowly. My father always used to say that people rush through the most important documents of their lives. I wasn't going to make that mistake. When I finally reached the signature page, I looked across the table. Grant met my eyes. For the first time since we'd met, he seemed less like an HOA president and more like a tired human being. "Do you know what the worst part is?" he asked. I raised an eyebrow. He looked out the window toward the entrance. "We could have avoided all of this with one phone call." For a moment neither of us spoke. Then I nodded. Yeah, because he was right. One conversation, one survey check, one honest discussion. Any of those things could have prevented everything. Instead, someone chose convenience. Someone assumed nobody would notice. Someone gambled and lost. We signed. The county recorded the easement. The dispute officially ended. The entrance stayed exactly where it was. The monument stayed. The landscaping stayed. The roadway stayed. To anyone driving by, nothing appeared different, but everything was different, because now every inch of that property was properly documented, properly compensated, properly protected. The development got to keep its entrance, and I received fair value for land they needed. A few months later, life returned to normal, mostly. The flowers around the monument grew taller. The grass filled in. New families moved into the neighborhood. Kids rode bicycles along the sidewalks. The drama slowly faded. But every now and then someone recognizes me around town. A resident, a contractor, a realtor. Sometimes they thank me, not because they enjoyed the conflict, because they understood what the conflict represented. Rules only matter when they apply equally to everyone. If powerful people can ignore boundaries whenever it's convenient, eventually boundaries stop meaning anything. That lesson goes far beyond property lines. It applies to business, friendships, communities, life. My father used to tell me something when I was young. He'd say, character shows up when people think nobody's watching. I didn't fully understand it back then. I do now. Because the people responsible for this situation didn't act the way they did while cameras were rolling. They acted that way when they thought nobody would notice. When they thought the landowner was gone. When they thought consequences wouldn't arrive. Unfortunately for them, consequences eventually showed up driving a tractor. And honestly, that's still my favorite part of the whole story. Not the money, not the agreement, not even the legal victory. The best part is knowing nobody got destroyed. Nobody lost their home. Nobody ended up bankrupt. Nobody spent years trapped in court. The problem was identified, documented, corrected. That's what real justice usually looks like. Not dramatic revenge, not screaming matches, not viral courtroom moments, just facts, evidence, paperwork, and patience. Even now, whenever I drive past that entrance, I sometimes smile, because beneath the polished stone, the expensive landscaping, and the picture-perfect appearance sits a reminder most people never see. Ownership isn't determined by confidence. It isn't determined by money. And it definitely isn't determined by who builds first. Ownership is determined by facts, and facts can be stubborn things. So now I'm curious what you think. If you came home after 8 days and discovered a developer had moved your fence, built on your property, and expected you to simply accept it, what would you have done? Would you have accepted the first offer to restore everything and walk away? Or would you have pushed for the permanent easement like I did? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I have a feeling this one is going to split people right down the middle. And if you enjoy stories about HOA drama, property disputes, small-town conflicts, and legal battles where patience beats panic, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stick around for the next story. Trust me, this wasn't the last time someone underestimated a quiet rancher with good records, a stubborn streak, and enough patience to let the facts do all the talking.